The following presentation is a production of Ride the Wave Media.
I'm just kind of always amazed at how easily frustrated we get with magical technology. Like, you're thousands of miles away from me, Callie, right? Like, I've never done the math, but it's probably upwards of 2,000 miles away from where I am and from Utah, do you think?
Yeah, from Utah, I'm going to go for 2,400 miles. So I'm in Oaxaca, Mexico on the Pacific coast.
Okay, so 2,400 miles away. For most of human history, that would have taken, the conversation that we're about to have would never have happened because I wouldn't even know that you're a real thing. And you would have no conception. I would have been one of those wild white barbarians from the north that you heard legends about, you never actually had a conversation with. And so it's amazing. It's amazing technology that we have that we get to talk instantly. And we can get really frustrated with it. Like today, trying to get you logged in, it took a couple of tries. Like we weren't really sure, and maybe it was going to happen and maybe it wasn't, but you're here now and I'm excited to have you here. So welcome on the podcast.
Thank you. I am really excited to be here and also grateful for technology, and kind of funny that we're going to be talking about the apocalypse as we're here with our little tech fails connecting.
Right. Exactly. Like this is easily the most cush apocalypse that we could imagine, because I'm indoors right now. It just snowed, but I have like central heating, so I'm not cold. I'm wearing a t-shirt. So let's kind of jump into this then. So welcome everyone to today's edition of Vibing the Apocalypse. This is your host, the Fresh King Benjamin. I'm here with my good friend, Callie King, and we're going to just talk about the apocalypse a little bit today. We'll see where it goes. Callie, do you want to just maybe tell us a little bit about you? And you can take that however you want. Like, why do you feel qualified, I guess, to come on to a show about the apocalypse and talk about it? What are your unique apocalyptic qualifications?
Oh, I love that question. And I hadn't given it much thought until this very moment, because I'll be honest, I don't give the apocalypse much thought, which makes me actually really excited to talk to you today. But what I think makes me qualified to talk about this is I find that I live a little bit between worlds, meaning just half an hour ago, I was back on a dirt road in a rural Mexican field, and there were farmers that had walked several miles to go back there and to work on their watermelon fields and their corn, feed their cows. And I was back there riding my horse. And then I come out of there. So I, ride out of there, get on my motorcycle to come here to my house, open my fancy laptop, and I'm talking to you 2,400 miles away.
Yeah.
So I think just the unique lifestyle that I've been able to live, being in a lot of really rural places, and I work with horses. I'm a horse trainer and a riding instructor by profession. And I teach that on the internet, which is a bit of a dichotomy in and of itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And what I'm interested to, what that kind of sparked in me is I think that you kind of have this really interesting ability maybe to sort of bridge the world of kind of rural, sort of old human, like humans have been riding horses for hundreds of thousands of years. Like that's like probably deep in our bones. We're like, and just that whole world that you described of like a rural farm, you walk for miles to get anywhere. It's sort of like it's sort of a slowed down world. It's kind of like what you can walk on your feet or on someone else's feet. And then you also can kind of step into this really fast-paced, very virtual, and your ability to kind of bridge both of those worlds, I think is interesting for the apocalypse, because I sort of think that we are in a little bit of a transition of kind of going back to more of a world like the world that you first described. I think we kind of got to this heyday of technology, and some things about that were really cool and other things were problematic, like the way that we kind of trashed the environment. And so I think that for a lot of people, it's becoming more and more important to sort of slow down and find different ways to sort of go back to that older lifestyle.
Yes. Yeah, I see that so much, and I hear that so much in the riders that I coach. Is so with horses and humans have gone through this unique history of it was actually kind of recent. I think that they don't know for sure, but they think it was around 15,000 years ago, maybe, that we first
Okay, so I
started
was off the
riding
order of
horses.
magnitude. Yeah, okay.
A
Just
little bit.
little disclaimer, guys. Remember, I did not go to public elementary school. I've only known that the Earth was more than 6,000 years old for like about 10 years. So I'm still getting used to the numbers. But so 15,000 years ago, we looked at horses and we were like, yeah, we could ride that.
Yeah. Yeah, how it started, no one knows, but they first that date goes to when they found horse head skulls. They found horse skulls, and they had bit marks on the jaw. So that was when we were using bits. We might have been
Oh,
using
wow.
riding before then, but we don't have evidence of it. But that's the first evidence that people were
That's
riding,
fascinating.
putting bits in the horses' mouths. Yeah.
Because arguably, like a bit, does a bit need to be metal, or were these bits made of something else?
That's a
Like, does
great
that mean
question.
we have to kind of get into like we're working with metal before we get evidence of that? Because it seems like we probably would have had. I mean, I'm not super horsey. I had actually at some point we should talk about this today because I had a number of kind of scary experiences with horses as a small kid, and so now I don't like them. But
Huh.
I would imagine that we probably were riding for a lot longer before we started using things like bits or saddles that that in more of our. But what's your take as the horse expert?
I suspect that as well, but even more interestingly, before horses were used for riding or for any kind of transportation, they were used for meat. So when we first domesticated horses, they were a cow basically. Like they were used for meat and milk. And there's places in the world. So I went to Mongolia 2 years ago, and they
Yes.
one of my favorite
Can you just
conversations.
pause for a moment and just
Yes.
tell the people why? Because you just didn't go to Mongolia. Like you didn't just like you went to Mongolia. Tell the listeners how you went to Mongolia.
So it had been a dream of mine, a like newspaper clipping pasted on the wall bucket list item to go and ride in the Mongol Derby. And the Mongol Derby is the longest horse race in the world. So it is, as the crow flies, it's 1,000 kilometers. I ended up doing 1,270. I went a little off track. And you do this race in the style of think of like Pony Express because it actually follows their old mail route system that was set
Oh,
up in the
interesting.
era of Genghis Khan and preluded our Pony Express. Our US Pony Express was based on that. So you switch horses every 35 to 40 kilometers and you ride all day long, and it's a race. So it's whoever can keep up that pace and play with Lady Luck and get there fastest wins. And they have really good regulations to take care of the horses. You know, the horses
Oh,
are
hell
well
yeah.
taken care of and not overridden during this event, but that's why I went to Mongolia.
Okay, so you went to Mongolia. That's, by the way, guys, that's how Callie does things. Is when that's so like you went to Mongolia and obviously you ran the world's longest horse race. And while you're in Mongolia, you learned that you were saying that because we started out by eating horses, which I think is hilarious. That because that means that at some point during our evolutionary history, there was a conversation where there was like a new hip, probably liberal caveman and like a super conservative caveman. And the liberal caveman was like, Dad, I just want to ride this horse. Like I just want to get on him. And you're like, we don't ride this horse. We eat. Horses are for eating.
Well, maybe this conversation happened first on the steppes of Mongolia and is still playing out today because one of the days after the race, I had the opportunity to speak to, there were 3 herders there, and that was the name of what they called people that had large herds of horses.
Okay.
And I had a translator with me, so I had the opportunity. I was like, can I go up, like, translate? I want to talk to these guys and learn more about their horses, their lifestyle. So the first thing I asked, I was, how many horses do you each have? And one was like, I've got 100, I've got 120, I've got 275. Wow, a lot of horses. And then I said, well, what do you do with the horses? Obviously, you're not riding them all. Do you milk them? What's the use? We eat them. Okay. So then next question, because my mind goes to, agriculture in the US, for example, beef cattle. Typically, they will raise, they raise a steer, and then there's a certain age where they're normally butchering and,
Slaughtered. Yeah.
yep, slaughtering the steer. So I thought, do they do the same thing with horses? So I asked, when do you eat them? When we feel like it. so
Oh,
so
that's so good.
essentially, I got out of a little bit more of the conversation that they pick the ones that they're drawn to ride. Those become their riding horses. When they're no longer useful as a riding horse, they slaughter them and they eat them. They use the mares a lot for milk, but also will eat them. And they just, as they need them, they use them. And as a person that obviously I love horses, but at the same time, I really respect that lifestyle because
Yeah.
they're honoring the horse. The horse is a huge part of their life. The horse has a hard life, but also a ton of freedom compared to the
Mhm.
horses that we have in the US that soft life, very little freedom. So,
Yeah, and it's interesting too to me because there's there's something kind of beautiful about the total consumption because it's almost like these little herds are sort of self-contained. So it's like we're going there's it seems like there's very little waste. Like in America, we have so we don't we're there's so much waste that's put off of everything that we do. And so I kind of love there's a way that I could kind of see that. It's sort of very beautiful that these horses are sort of they get their life. They're kind of ridden. The ones that are like fun to ride get ridden. The ones that some of them get milked, right? And then as they sort of outlive, they get to a point where it's not really easy for them to be of use in that way. Then they sort of get consumed and put there. It's sort of, it all seems like it's part of the same system, which I think is really kind of lovely.
yes, it is. It is. And it's just as you said, there's a lot less waste because there's not room for waste. These families are living
Yeah.
out there and they have what they need to survive. They're definitely not living in excess. And to me, there's a beauty in that as well.
Yeah, I think that there's something about like humans, we can exist on far less than we think that we need. Like we can survive. Like our standard of living, especially in the West, is so absurdly high, and we don't need like you don't need all of the junk food. You don't need cars. You don't need air conditioning. You don't really even need houses, although houses are nice. There's so much less that you can kind of have and actually live a pretty fulfilling and maybe even arguably like maybe even a more fulfilling life because you're less sort of stuck in the trappings of the world that you have to kind of live and support in order to have all of those things, right? But there is something kind of like I have no idea what horse milk tastes like, but I'll bet it's not really any different than like cow's milk. Like you just get used to it. And so there's something kind of lovely about the idea of having, I mean, I'm just imagining this lifestyle now and it's like really getting to me because you're basically just like on the steps with your little yurt and your hundreds of horses and you just kind of travel around and eat the horses and ride the horses and milk the horses. And that's your life. And that sounds pretty fucking cool.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned we started down this track of talking about horses because you mentioned how you've noticed and I've noticed as well that a lot of people are looking for a return to this kind of more, you know, feet in the dirt,
Yeah.
working hands kind of lifestyle. And I think it's really interesting because I had to go through this transition myself when I moved to Mexico a few years ago. Is my standard of living went down. And it was a bit of a bumpy transition period for me at first because I was really drawn to a simpler way of living and I was really drawn to some of these things. And yet, to really live, there's one thing to go and to have that experience, to like go and
Right.
spend a month camping or whatever. There's another thing to actually accept the hardships and the lower standard of living that comes with that. Now, my lowering my
What are
standard of living is small. I mean, I'm talking about like I don't have hot water here. So I learned that you just take
yeah,
cold showers every day. Don't
arguably it's
have
probably better for you.
I think so. And it's
Like
also it's
cold
very
showers
warm.
are like, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. But okay, so so cold showers. What are some other kind of it's sort of incidental ways that the standard of living got hit, but it's sort of like the cost for that simpler that so I remember when I was in Uganda, I imagine it's probably similar that a big part of us was the toilet only worked sometimes. And
Mhm.
on the days that it didn't work, there was a pit in the back and that's what you used.
Yeah, that's I could relate to that. Now, I'm still living definitely on the high well, I would say on the moderately high end of the scale of living here. This is one of those interesting
Okay.
beach communities that happens in a lot of developing countries where you've got some of the like uber fancy going on and then you've got kind of
Mhm.
this big middle and I'm kind of in the low of the big middle and then you've got the low end of the locals that are and this is where I find unfortunate about just the development of things. Like they haven't been benefited by the development that's come in. So and the resources that were so easy to them are no longer there. So they've kind of fallen into
Mm.
their standard of living has gone down because they've got to work so much harder to maintain what they had before easily.
Oh, interesting.
Before
Yeah,
they could
what an
just
interesting such a complex system.
yes,
That's
it
so
is.
interesting.
It is. And a specific example of that is, before where they could just walk down the street and pick mangoes from a tree and go fishing and have their food and not have to work. Now, those kind of
Yeah,
resources are much harder to find because there's so many more people here and not just people moving in, just more people in general, that
yeah.
those resources are harder to find. So now they're having to go and maybe work all day at a hotel or work all day picking the watermelons back in the field because the easy food, the easy resources isn't there. So yeah, it's such an
It's a
interesting
bummer that we
system.
do that as human because that seems like a pretty common pattern of development where sort of and because it happened in the United States, I think it sort of happened everywhere where we there were sort of these pre-capitalist, maybe like more developed ecosystems of that were really rich in food and that were pretty easy to like it's there's gives and takes, right? Like on the one hand, you didn't have modern medicine. So if you broke your leg, you were fucked. Like that's it. You're done. Bye-bye, buddy. But you can also just walk down wherever, like walk down through the mango grove and pick some mangoes and get some fish, and then you're done. And that's such a and then that it's interesting to I've never quite heard the description of like as soon as this development comes in, it sort of creates this lack. Those resources start to get exploited in other ways, and so you get sort of some of the benefits of this modern culture, but you also lose some of the simplicity. So we kind of got onto that because you were saying that horses are maybe sort of a bridge for people to kind of come back into sort of that simple living.
I think they can be because horses went from okay, we were eating them, they were our food, and then we were riding them for the sake of transportation, or at least I'm assuming that it was transportation in the beginning. Maybe there
Yeah.
was some sport and enjoyment to it, but I'm going to assume it was mostly transportation, warfare, and then it transitioned really only recently into being predominantly about sport. So there's show jumping, there's racing, there's all of the different horse sports.
Yeah.
And it's been even more recent that now it's transitioned that sport is no longer the biggest part of the equine industry, but pleasure is. So people have horses and are riding horses simply because they like horses and they like riding horses. And they want the connection with the horse. So the focus has now come back around to how does the horse feel about this? How do we connect to the horse? How do we
Yeah.
understand the horse? Which is what I love. That's what I teach. But it's really interesting to see it come back around where we're still, as humans, we're still using the horse for our own value, really, if you look at it honestly. We're still using the horse, but now we're using the horse of how can the horse make me feel good and in some cases be my therapist. Where before we were using the horse because he's fast and he has a strong body and he can pull this cart.
Right. And before that, we were using him because he tasted really good.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's I think that's probably a win for the horses. Like if I were a horse, I would way rather be someone's like therapy buddy, and we go on fun rides and like we have a connection and we go on cool adventures than somebody's burger.
Well,
It
it's
is kind
also
of interesting to see that. No, go ahead.
Yeah, I gotta jump in on this one. So I don't have my actual stats on this, but this is an interesting little rabbit hole about evolution of species, because
Okay.
back in the day, so pre-domestication of the horse, supposedly zebras were same number or even potentially outnumbered horses. So zebras, different species. They're both in the equine family, but they're a
Interesting.
different species. And they're a different species. They have different
Can I
behaviors.
interject there with just a quick question?
Yes.
Where do horses, so zebras come out of Africa. Do horses also come out of Africa? Do you know where the horse initially evolves?
So they actually believe that they initially evolved in North America, and that would be that's like zebra ancestors as well. So gets into a big thing when people fight
Oh,
about wild/feral horses in the U.S. because they initially evolved in North America. They went extinct.
okay.
Equines in general. Zebras also fall under
They
equines.
went extinct, but did some of them probably snuck across over into Asia. So
Exactly.
like
They snuck into
Mongolia.
Asia,
Okay.
Mongolia,
And then they kind
the
of come over
ones.
into Africa. Okay.
Yep.
Then there's equal number of zebras and horses. Okay. I just wanted
Yes.
that picture in my head. Okay,
Yes.
go. So equal number of
So
zebras, horses.
then a big difference in their behavior is zebras are territorial, which makes them a lot more aggressive because they will have a territory and they will protect that territory. Horses are
So
not
zebras are
territorial.
assholes.
If you're trying
I
to
love that
trade
because they look
one
so
through
cute.
pressure.
They look so cute. Zebras do. They look like, but they're just like wicked mean. They're like, no, do not mess with me.
Yeah,
I love it. Okay.
horses can be dominated through force, which has made
Okay.
them an easily domesticated, easily trainable species to humans because they can be
Okay.
dominated by force. They're a less aggressive species. They're not protective of spaces, all of that. Zebras, much more aggressive, much harder to train. And if you watch their numbers, the population of horses exploded with humans.
With humans. Yeah. That makes me think
Zebras,
of cows. That makes me think of chicken, like all of these animals that domesticated grass is one where, and I've even heard the argument
mm,
that in some ways we think, oh, we domesticated all of these things. But in other ways, it's sort of like we're all part of this same system. And it seems that becoming useful to Homo sapiens is a pretty banger evolution.
yes. And that's where, we say we're using horses, and we are. It's not to downplay any maltreatment or abuse that happens to horses. But also, when you really zoom out and you look at it from a species level, who's using who?
Right. Right. And I love that. I actually really like that view because if you can sort of let go of maybe some of the yuckier connotations of the word use, right?
Mhm.
It's actually pretty cool to be of use, right? Like as humans, even like we want to be useful. We want to have interesting and fun things to do. And I kind of love the idea that I'm sort of tickled by the idea that in our natural, as sort of our natural state as human beings, that we aren't really in conflict with nature, that we're actually in this really beautiful symbiosis with nature. And I think I sort of imagine that as like Gaia, right? So Gaia to me is like the sum total of the natural world. And I like to think that Gaia thinks that we're really cute and really clever and likes us, right? And I I like also the idea that as species, we've also really helped each other because I mean, I haven't studied this, but I would imagine that um, humans mastering the horse was a pretty important step in human civilization because that was really one of the, I mean, we still use that term today, right? Horsepower, right?
Mhm.
So that's really maybe one of the first times that humans were able to sort of access more power than we can generate, right? And one of maybe the defining characteristics of humans is that we are really good at finding ways to manipulate and use power that's not generated by us. And so anyway, that's kind of interesting to think that it's not just that we've been using this horse, that there's sort of this symbiotic relationship that's really been good for both species.
Yes. And you are so right in the horse being part of many turning points in human civilization. One example of this is so it was also in Mongolia under the reign of Genghis Khan. So in that era where the Mongols were conquering that part of
Just
the
kicking
world,
ass. Yeah.
part of their success is they invented the stirrup. So before they were riding horses, but they were riding without stirrups, meaning they're just sitting on their back and hanging on with their legs. With the invention of the stirrup, they could now stand up and they were amazing archers. So they could shoot their bows and arrows in all directions. They could see in all directions. They could ride. If anyone's ever ridden a horse without stirrups, you can't ride that long. You get tired. The horse
Yeah.
gets tired. Their backs take a beating. Where once you've got stirrups, you can ride so much longer. And that was a huge factor in their military success. And their military, what they did absolutely changed the
I mean,
world.
shaped changed the entire world. That's
Yeah.
fascinating. And I love that when I imagine the stirrup, that tool seems really clever to me because it's sort of what it does is I never considered that because I've ridden a horse with a stirrup and without a stirrup. And in fact, when I was a young kid and I would ride a horse, we couldn't reach the stirrups. And so I would like fall off all the time. And I hated it because I was like, look, you're just putting me on top of this horse. And I'm bouncing all over the place and I have nothing to keep myself. So the first time I rode with stirrups, that actually fit me. I was probably like 13 or 14. And I remember when I had those stirrups, I was like, oh, this is a different game. This is a
Yeah.
totally different game. And what's interesting is that, but I never thought of it from the horse's perspective. Like it never occurred to me that a rider who's just like bouncing on your back, that's just like on your back the whole time, that would be a lot less easy to bear as a ride than someone who's got stirrups. And so then you can, because what stirrups allow you to do is to kind of engage with the horse, right? You can sort of like get into flow and sort of move with the horse rather
Yes.
than just like, blah, 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 blah. And
Yes.
yeah, so what a brilliant and clever tool that really is. It's not about domination. It's about synchronization. It's about helping you and the horse kind of get into sync. And obviously, like you're the rider, you're the one that's in charge. But there is something really beautiful about that in charge relationship that seems to be good for both species.
Yeah. So I'm curious because you obviously rode and it sounds like you had a lot of falls. Was it the falls or was it something else that just, you never caught the horse bug?
I think that what it really was is that the I don't think that it was very safe to ride horses in my childhood. So we had a number of horses, we had a ton of kids. None of the horses were really well trained. And so there were sort of like, and then none of the like I remember like the way that the older adults around me, right? So we're kind of on this little ranch outside of we're separated. There were like uncles and sort of older adults who are kind of there. And I'm seeing them interact with the horses. And there's a lot of like harsh anger. There's a lot of like, I remember I have this one memory of one uncle, like kind of getting on the horse and sort of like beating the shit out of it. Like really being really aggressive because the horse had like bucked him off. And so he just like came out and like was really, really rough. And so the whole energy of that it didn't feel very safe, I think, as a kid. And so when I would get put up on these horses, in fact, I think the first time that it happened is that we were riding two horses. I was riding one horse and I was really young. I was probably 3 or 4. And then my brother who's my same age as I am, and then another brother who's a little bit older are riding another horse. And I'm on another horse with my dad. The other horse bucks the two of them off. So they get bucked off, they fall. And then my dad gets off the horse, leaves me on the horse and like goes and like, and so I'm like on this horse, like freaking out, like, oh, what? And so I think that was really my first experience. And so because of that, it felt difficult to relax when I was with the horse. And so I think they would probably pick up on my sort of tension, and then it wouldn't go well. So when I was like 8, I rode a pony and got kind of tense, and it wasn't really well trained either. And so I got kind of tense, and then it like bucked me into a fence. And so like, that was just kind of that I didn't really have a lot of great experiences with horses. So I think it never really like caught me where I was like, oh, I want to do this. It was more like, oh, this feels unsafe and I want to stay away.
Yeah. Yeah, I get it. It's funny how those, especially when we're kids, those first experiences can just color something for life.
Yeah, and I think that if the situation maybe would have been handled a little bit differently because I think that I probably could have bounced back from like, because even with the first one, right? Like I didn't actually fall off a horse. I was on the horse, it didn't buck, and I got to like, and the horse was fine. Like I kept it still, like nothing bad happened. I think it was just that heightened state of like, oh, I'm not okay. Nothing's, and then that feeling wasn't like, my dad didn't come back and be like, hey, like, I'm sure that you're also scared. Like, let's kind of resolve that. And so it just sort of like hung on to me. But I do remember when I was probably 14 or 15, and I got a stirrup. Like I got some horses with some stirrups that fit me. And I remember there was this moment where we were like out chasing. So we used horses primarily for herding cows, right? So we had a bunch of cows on like a big spread of land, and we'd go and like round them up. So I was doing that. And the whole time I was riding, I had like the reins, and then I had the saddle horn. I was just like holding on to that saddle horn and the reins, and I was bouncing crazy. I was like, oh, right. And so I'm doing that. And then we start to kind of there a couple of the other horses come by, and we start to kind of start to kind of trot. And so then it's even worse, right? I'm like, oh. And then I sort of get bounced hard, and I kind of like really land in my seat, and I sort of feel my feet in the stirrups, and I'm like, and I sort of get that bounce, and I'm like, oh, I can use these stirrups, and I can kind of bounce with the horse. And so then I start trying to get into that, and then the horse kind of picks up and it breaks into a gallop, and I let go of the horn, and I'm like galloping with this horse, and I felt like really free. It was a kind of a magical moment, because it had been like a lot of like pretty negative experiences with horses, and then sort of like slowly getting into sync with this animal. And then when he would open up, like a horse running and you're on top, is a pretty ecstatic experience. Like it feels pretty fucking great.
Yes. Yeah. And it doesn't matter how many times how many different horses, it's still just as fun every single time.
Yeah. Yeah. So I could actually imagine kind of getting into that a little bit more, because there's something about that, because I like things that are fast, that are that require a certain amount of like control. Like I'm imagining like my favorite thing, one of my favorite things to do is to ride my one wheel, which is like a board with a big giant tire in the middle. And you can take that thing anywhere. Like you can take it over like up in the trails, like you can take it literally anywhere. And it's like high speed, high, like consequences matter. Like you gotta be paying attention. And I feel the same way about snowboarding too, where I like the being at speed and having to make decisions and choices at speed is pretty fucking cool as a human, I think.
Yeah. 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 It's that flow state where there's
Yeah.
not enough time the brain just automatically lets go of all of the other tracks that are running in the background because you got to just do what you're doing in the moment and
I
respond
have
to
to
in
be
the moment.
entirely right here.
Yes.
And being able to sort of drop back into that state, it almost is always preceded by like a feeling of like out of control where like, oh my God, 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 oh my God. And then you sort of have to drop. You're like, oh, actually, yeah. So now I'm here. That seems to be a pretty important apocalypse skill too. Like being able to get into that flow state. And I'm even just imagining now from this conversation that I think that my life would probably be a lot more fun if I were more intentional about getting myself in that place more regularly, where I'm kind of like in that zone of like, I'm just buzzing and we're just doing it. And because that feels really human.
Yeah. What you just said there, I think you have just identified what I would consider be the two most important apocalypse skills. The first one we covered in the beginning, which is being willing to let the standard of living go down and go back to a simpler way of life, embracing that. The second one, I think you just hit it, is being in those kinds of not even literal high speed, but like high risk situations and not letting panic take over. Because in that moment where you just described, where you're like, oh shit, oh shit, oh shit, what's going to happen? The brain can either go into panic mode and then the wheels fly off. Yeah.
Yeah. Then it's gone.
Or you drop into responding. You drop into flow state. And of course, that's easier when it's an activity that you've got the skill for, but you can always respond to something rather than panic. So it's...
Yeah. And I think I love that frame is really helpful of like, when you sort of reach that moment of like, it's make or break, like it's make or break. It's either going to work or it's not. And being able to sort of recognize, hang on, I've got, do not disturb me, phone. Okay. Being able to kind of recognize that I can either panic or I can respond. And I think that's a really powerful frame because it's either, or I'm going to just, it's almost like that all turns off and I'm sliding back and I'm just seeing what's right here. And as it comes up, I almost don't even need to think about it. Like I get into this pretty well when I'm on my one wheel, because in order to do the one wheel well, you got to be fairly balanced. You've got to kind of be back, sort of like back in your hips and in your legs. You've got to be really loose because you don't actually know what is coming. I can see, but if I'm just relying on what I see, I'm going to miss some stuff because maybe the ground moves in a certain way. Maybe there's a rock. Maybe there's a gust of wind, right? There could be anything. And if I'm loose and reactive, then when that happens, I'll kind of like teeter on the edge of losing control for a while. Like maybe I'll bounce on a big rock and then I've kind of got to move, right? I'll be kind of like out of control as it's like a controlled out of control because I'm loose and I'm just kind of vibe. And then I'm coming back into it and then I've got it again.
Yeah.
And I can't do that if I hit that and I panic, then it's like, then I'm also tight. I'm like, oh, I can't hit anything. If I hit anything, I'm going to go everywhere. And then you do hit something and then you do go everywhere.
Yes.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's a pretty cool, that makes me want to go out and ride. Cause I think that because I've heard people talk about having like a flow practice. Like I did this course, I can't remember the guy's name, but he claimed to be the master of flow. Like that was he was like, I'm the flow captain or something. It was like a Mind Valley course. He was like, I'm the flow. He didn't say flow captain, but he was like, an expert. I don't know how you become an expert in flow, but he was and said, and he said that his flow practice was skiing, where and it was religious for him. Every winter, he'd go to Park City and he'd ski for months. And the reason for that is that it trained him to get into that flow state. So he was used to kind of being there. It was a resource that he had. And then he could translate that into other areas. And so I'm just kind of realizing that I think that's another really valuable, like not only the ability to get into flow state and be in that responsive state as an apocalypse skill, but actively practicing something that puts you in that zone so that you've got a big buffer. You've got a lot of bandwidth in that area, because it's not just immediate, it's not just tangible physical things that we have to respond to. The whole world is crazy right now. If there's anything that the last 3 years have taught us, it's that literally anything can happen. Like there are aliens now. That's how insane the world got over the last 3 years. And so we are never going to be able to predict it, but we can respond to it. And I think that response is sort of the essence of kind of the more calamitous times of something breaking down like this before we can start. Because I think eventually we get to a point where the world settles down enough that we can start to be a little more proactive. We can start to be a little more like building. But right now it does kind of feel like it's just a little bit like, just write it and we'll figure it out as we go along.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that on training the flow state. And I think that is so true. And when we do activities that have an amount of real physical risk to them, whether it's riding horses, whether it's doing the one wheel, whether it's doing the skiing, the learning process of doing that physically risky thing, it forces that process of going into something where you feel activated, you feel scared, you feel the oh shit, and then you have to learn to respond. And we can get stuck in that fear, but if we stay with that activity and we keep doing it, the learning process is going to kick us out of that you start just learning to get into that flow. And then absolutely we can take that into the areas of life that don't necessarily have the physical risk, but have the emotional risk, or have maybe the physical risk isn't right there in front of us, it's happening somewhere else, but we can respond to it better because of that skill.
And what's so cool about that is that you get to practice doing, you get the practice that you get to do to build that muscle is doing cool shit. Like,
right?
You get to go out and ride a horse in Mongolia. You get to like ride a motor. Like there's you get to do kind of these higher risk physical things that are actually pretty fun to do. I wanted to kind of take the conversation because one of the things that you said kind of made me interested in a question. Because did you grow up on the farm that we've talked about? Were you a rural child?
Yes, I was. So I grew up on the farm. My grandparents were Amish dairy farmers. Now, by the time that I was growing up, they didn't have an active dairy anymore, but they still lived there on the farm. And my father was a carpenter, so he was mostly using the farm for his furniture and carpentry business. So I grew up on a farm, but it was no longer an active dairy farm, but all of the roots of that area and the history of my family was farmers.
All the trappings were still kind of there. Did it feel like that your childhood, that there was more opportunity for physical risk because of where you grew up?
Oh, so much. So much. I mean, I spent my day, and I was homeschooled off and on. So I wasn't homeschooled the whole time, but I was homeschooled off and on because we also traveled a lot to Colorado. And my parents had a ranch, or spent time on a ranch there that was also very rural. And I was an only child. I wasn't the same age. Like all of my cousins were, different ages. So basically, I always joke I grew up with goats because I kind of did. I spent a lot of time with the goats and the dogs, and then
Yeah.
eventually the horses too.
There are worse people to grow up with than goats.
Hey, they were fantastic childhood friends, fantastic. But yeah, I did a lot of just getting myself into trouble and then finding how to get myself out of trouble. Like
Yeah.
climbing into weird things and then realizing I didn't know how to get down and just having to figure out because there was no one around to help. And
Yeah.
I'm really grateful for that experience of being able to grow up not just connected to the land, but also grow up with that like risk, physical risk, doing things was just a normal part of life.
Yeah, I feel that way too, kind of about my childhood, where there are definitely aspects of how I grew up that I would have liked to have, like, if I could have passed, I would have passed on those. But there are also kind of parts of growing up that I feel really grateful for, and one of them is that, like you described, there was there was a abundant opportunity for me growing up on a rural ranch to do things that were unsafe, but they were sort of like safely unsafe. Like
Mhm,
because I was like, I think one of the things about humans is that we don't want to actually get hurt. And so,
mhm,
so if you just kind of like, as a kid, I almost never did anything that was so risky that I got really hurt,
mhm.
because my natural kind of inclination to not be hurt would sort of protect me from that. I would scale back, right?
Yeah.
And a couple of times it didn't work out and I did get seriously hurt. But even then, that was like, oh, great. Now I know where the edge of that is. And so like I feel as an adult, it's kind of some of the benefit of that risky childhood, because I feel like as an adult, I'm less brittle. I'm kind of a little more like I'm comfortable with pain. I'm comfortable with like all of these like, because I've been kind of playing, like I was climbing on, like my favorite thing to do is we had these huge sandstone boulders on our property, and they were like 15 feet high, some of them 10 feet high. And they were kind of placed. I don't even know how ended up this way, but they were kind of like close to each other. And so we could climb up on these boulders and then we could jump from one boulder to another boulder. It was like jumping across the roof of a house. And, and that was pretty risky, right? Like if you fall, if you mess that
Mhm.
up, there are some consequences,
Yeah.
but you don't mess it up, right? Like you kind of learn to,
Yes.
like, I remember once there was this one particular jump, probably 10 feet up, 10 feet high. And it really wasn't that far. It was like maybe 3.5 feet of open air between this one rock and this other rock, and maybe 10 or 12 feet down. And all the other kids, I was about 2 years younger. So they were all jumping across it, no problem. I'm like this little kid. And for hours, I'd like stand on the edge and I'd look over at the other side and I'd just be like, ah, and then I'd like back up, and then I'd kind of like run to the edge and stop and be like, oh no. And I did that a whole bunch, like for days probably. And then eventually I just did it. And what I learned in that moment, it's kind of like that same moment of like where you kind of like you go all the way, right? So what I did is I'm like, look, I'm just gonna go for it. I'm just gonna do it. And as soon as I did it, I landed like I was like 2 feet on the other edge. Like I had plenty of space, right? But that was a risk. That was risky, right? I was 10 feet in the air as like a 6-year-old trying to jump across a rock face. But what that did for my confidence, what that did for my sense that I could actually exert power in the world and kind of do the things that I wanted to do, like it was a pretty cool experience. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I hadn't been living a little bit of a dangerous life.
Yeah, totally. I have a friend that lives a active, risky life. Surfs, skateboards, all that kind of stuff. And he always says, if you haven't fallen, you haven't found your limit yet.
Yeah.
So I right now the thing in my life that is like pushing my limits the most is swimming in bigger water and bigger surf. I'm learning to surf
Mm.
as well, but part of that learning process is I just need to learn how to pass waves better, how to get through the waves. So this started with 2 years ago. I decided to do the lifeguard training here because I figured what a better way to improve my swimming than surrounded by lifeguards. Hopefully, they're not going to let me drown. So I made
Totally.
it. I made it through 2 years ago, which was pretty impressive. I was a poor swimmer, like to the point where I wasn't even comfortable putting my head under and like truly swimming. I would just kind of doggy paddle. But I made it through last year. This year, it just ended about 5 days ago. 6 days ago, I had to be rescued during lifeguard training.
Oh no.
So
That's
I,
the edge. There it is.
that's the edge. Exactly. I came out of the water and I'm not going to lie. I went for a run down to the beach and I was like super embarrassed. And then I just switched it in my mind. I'm like, that's the water equivalent of falling down. I just found my
Yeah.
edge. Yeah.
I think that is maybe like another, like, maybe, I don't know if this is our third or fourth, I haven't been writing down, but another great apocalypse skill is recognizing that failure, falling, like any of those things that we don't like, just reframing that as, oh, that's the edge. Because you really can't, like, I learned how to one wheel, right? I'd never skateboarded. I'd never done anything like that. And as a 30-year-old man, I was like, I'm going to one wheel. And I fell off a whole bunch. Like I fell off real early on and like jacked up my shoulder and like I couldn't use my shoulder for like a week. And I was like, oh God, I hate myself. Why am I doing this? I'm stupid. And then I was like, oh, actually, no, that I've never fallen like that again. I've still fallen. But what I've found is that when I fall better. I've actually learned that experience of really getting myself jacked. What it taught me was, if you're going to fall, keep your arms in.
Yes. Powerful
Keep
life
your arms in
lessons.
and tuck and roll, and then you're going to be good. And that is valuable because I'm probably going to fall again, right? I'm probably going to continue to be in spaces that push and challenge me, that sort of push me over the edge. And now I kind of know how to do that safely in a way that is like contained, and that a way that I know that I can bounce back from, because that was just the edge. I just need to, and now I know where it is, and you almost never need to find the edge twice.
Yeah. Talk about important life lessons. People usually give things about, enjoy the present moment or treasure this or that. I think one of the most important life lessons is how to fall down. And you just said
Mm,
it. Keep your tuck and roll, keep your arms in. Don't stick your hand out unless you're going to hit your
yeah.
head. You know.
Tuck it in, keep it loose. Like it's like everything, like keep it loose, keep it soft, and then kind of roll. And you can fall. I've fallen now in some gnarly terrain. I fell on an obstacle course at Burning Man on my one wheel while I had a beer in my hand.
That's a great
And
combination.
great combination. Like definitely some good ideas were going down at that moment. And I felt fine. Like I landed, rolled, I was fine, right? We're so much more durable as humans than we really think that we are. We can take so much more punishment, so much more pain, like so many more than we think, because we're actually so sturdy. And it's just this thing, right? The thing in between our ears, that thing tells us, oh, you're weak. Oh, you're soft. Oh, don't be careful. That's going to hurt. Ah, wah, wah. But that thing will do that for anything, right? Any amount of physical discomfort. Is the brain has basically one lever, which is you're going to die. You're going to die. You're going to die. You're going to die. And it thinks you're going to die if you're in a cold shower, or it thinks you're going to die if you're getting chased by a tiger. Those two things are equivalent for the human brain. And so really giving ourselves time to kind of get in that space and recognizing that I can feel like I'm going to die and I'm actually not going to die. That's actually my body getting ready to do something really cool.
Yeah.
Or die, because eventually we're all going to.
Happens to all of us. Might as well go out with a bang.
Might as well go out doing something really cool. Yeah.
That's
Callie,
the plus side.
I have loved this conversation so much. We are about at time. So I want to just ask you two final things. So one is just, is there anything that you feel like is unsaid that you want to say about anything that we've talked about the apocalypse in general, about life, And then the second thing is just if people want to connect with you, how can they find you?
Great questions. I'm gonna share this little like story was in my head. I'm going back now to when we were talking about the culture here where I live in the coast town of Mexico. And I think this is just another little story that so encapsulates how we as humans sometimes have trouble relating to each other. And it might even be true for listeners, depending on where this little clip lands in your recording, might even be true for listeners who were hearing us talk about all the physical risk stuff and was like, that does not sound like fun. So I was in line at the immigration office to do something with my visa. It's always an adventure. And waiting in line there, I met a man he was Mexican. He was a lawyer. He was also in line to do something at the immigration office. And we ended up chatting. And he just told me a little story that perfectly summed up the culture here. He said, my father was a fisherman and he would go out and he would go fishing every morning and he would catch 2 or 3 fish, which was enough that my family needed to eat for the day. And he would come back in and then he would just hang out and sleep under the palm tree or do whatever for the rest of the day. Get his nets ready for fishing the next morning. And he said, I grew up with having more influence from the modern world that was coming here. And I started to see my father as lazy. So I asked him, there's so many fish out there. Why don't you just stay out another 2 or 3 hours, catch more fish, and we'll sell these fish? And my father said, well, that would be greedy because we only need 2 or 3 fish. So to his father, going out and taking more than only he needed was greed. And to this man growing up, not taking advantage of what was available in the time it was available was laziness. I loved that story.
That is so fascinating. And not even that one is right or one is wrong, that those are 2 perspectives on the world.
Yeah.
And we kind of need both. Like we kind of need both of those energies in our culture, because especially now when I just think about all of the ways that we've overfished Earth.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's a deep wisdom in his father's adage of like, look, I'm only going to take what I need.
Mm-hmm.
Oh man, I love that. Thanks for sharing that. That's cool. That's a cool thing to end on. How can people connect with you?
So probably one of the most fun ways to connect with me is also through my podcast. So I do a podcast with one of my best friends, Andrea Wadey. It's called Grab Life by the Reins. And we share stories. Many of those stories involve horses and adventures with horses. Andrea also moved out of her home country of England and moved to Costa Rica, lived in Costa Rica for 18 years. So we have a lot of stories about being white girls in foreign countries and the adventures and the lessons that come to us through that. And
that podcast is hilarious, by the way. I started listening and I just love both of you. You're both such great storytellers and you vibe together so well. Like it's so much fun to listen to you guys tell stories to each other.
Yeah, we have so much fun doing that podcast. Love sharing the stories, and that is a great place to connect with me. And also, if you're listening to this and you decide, you know what, I want to learn to ride a horse, you can find me at horseclass.com, because that's what I do in my quote unquote professional life. Is I teach horse training and riding and all things horses.
Awesome. So yeah, check out Callie, check out her podcast, Grab Life by the Reins. And then if this podcast made you you're like, I'm going to be a horse person now, Callie can be your horse person mentor, horseclass.com. As always, you guys, you can follow me on social media, Instagram, TikTok, YouTube at The Fresh King Benjamin. I do have a show coming up next week. So next Sunday on April 7th at 7:30 p.m. at the Harriman Redemption Bar and Grill. That's where it's going to be. And if you use my name when you buy tickets and you just pop in my name, Benjamin, as a discount code, you can save $2 whole, which will probably buy you half a beer. So you should definitely come out to that. It's going to be Comedy Church. We're going to be talking about the law of chastity. It's going to be hilarious. Thanks for tuning in. Callie, thanks for being on. And everybody, take care out there.
Thank you so much.